heroes become villains, where God's chosen king becomes an adulterer and murderer, and where a kingdom built on divine promise crumbles through human failure. This isn't Sunday school, David. This is the uncut, uncensored reality of power, passion, and prophecy. Watch a king spiral from dancing before God to hiding behind palace walls. See a family destroyed by lust, revenge, and civil war. Witness the moment God makes a promise that will echo for 3,000 years and change human history forever. 2 Samuel contains the most brutal family drama, the most shocking political scandals, and the most crucial prophetic moment in the Old Testament. This book doesn't just tell David's story. It reveals why the Bible needed Jesus Christ. Every crown must fall, every kingdom must crumble, until the true king comes. Buckle up. You're about to discover why 2 Samuel is the Bible's most essential and explosive book. David was in Ziklag when a man came running to him with terrible news. The stranger fell to the ground and bowed, his clothes torn and dirt on his head. This Amalekite told David that he had escaped from the battlefield, where Israel had suffered a crushing defeat. The news got worse. Both Saul and Jonathan were dead. But then the messenger made a fatal mistake. He claimed that he had found Saul wounded and dying, and that Saul had begged him to finish him off. The man even brought Saul's crown and bracelet as proof. What he thought would earn him a reward became his death sentence. David's reaction shocked everyone present. Instead of celebrating his enemy's death, he tore his clothes and wept. His men did the same, mourning and fasting until evening. Then David turned to the messenger and asked a simple question that sealed the man's fate. In chapter 1, verse 14, David said, "How is it you were not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Without hesitation, David ordered one of his men to strike down the Amalekite, saying in verse 16, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" In chapter 1, verse 14, David said, "How is it you were not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Without hesitation, David ordered one of his men to strike down the Amalekite, saying in verse 16, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" In verse 19, David sang, "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen." He continued in verse 23, "Saul and Jonathan. In life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions." After mourning was complete, David faced a critical decision. Where should he go next? He didn't act on his own wisdom, but sought God's guidance. In chapter 2, verse 1, we read that David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. David obeyed immediately, taking his 2 wives and all his men with their families to Hebron. The move proved wise. The men of Judah came to him and anointed him king over the tribe of Judah. This was David's first official coronation, though he had been secretly anointed by Samuel years earlier. David's first act as king showed his character. He learned that the men of Jabesh Gilead had buried Saul's body, so he sent messengers to thank them. In verse 5, David told them, "May you be blessed by the Lord for showing this kindness to Saul, your master, by burying him." He even invited them to join his kingdom, saying in verse 7, "Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." But while David was building loyalty in the south, trouble was brewing in the north. Abner, who had been Saul's army commander, wasn't ready to accept David as king. He took Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, across the Jordan River to Mahanaim. There, in verse 9, Abner made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. The kingdom was now split in 2. David ruled in Hebron over Judah for 7.5 years, while Ishbosheth ruled from Mahanaim over the other tribes for 2 years. The stage was set for civil war. The Cold War between the two kingdoms turned hot at a place called Gibeon. Abner led Ishbosheth's men to the pool there, while Joab brought David's forces to the same location. The two armies sat on opposite sides of the pool, staring at each other like wild animals ready to pounce. Abner called across the water with what seemed like a reasonable suggestion. In verse 14, he said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." Joab agreed, saying simply, "All right, let them do it." What followed was both spectacular and horrifying. 12 young men from each side stood up for single combat. But instead of a fair fight, verse 16 tells us something strange happened. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. All 24 warriors died in the same moment. This bizarre scene triggered a larger battle. The fighting spread beyond the champions to both armies, and David's men proved stronger. They chased Abner's forces across the countryside, but one young man made a decision that would haunt everyone for years to come. Asahel, Joab's younger brother, was known for being incredibly fast. Verse 18 says he was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. When he saw Abner retreating, he decided to chase the veteran commander personally. Abner tried to warn him off, calling back in verse 22, "Turn aside from pursuing me. Why should I strike you down? Then how could I face your brother Joab?" But Asahel wouldn't listen. He kept chasing Abner, determined to bring down the famous warrior. Finally, Abner had no choice. He spun around and drove the butt of his spear through Asahel's stomach. The young man died instantly. When the other soldiers reached the spot where Asahel had fallen, they all stopped in shock. The sight of the dead hero lying in his own blood ended the chase. By evening, Abner had escaped to safety, but the damage was done. A blood debt now existed between the families that would demand payment in the future. The civil war dragged on for years, but the tide was clearly turning. Chapter 3, verse 1 summarizes the situation perfectly. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. David's strength showed in his growing family. During his time in Hebron, 6 sons were born to him by different wives. His firstborn was Amnon, whose mother was Ahinoam. Then came Kileab by Abigail, Absalom by Maacah, Adonijah by Haggith, Shephatiah by Abital, and Ithream by Eglah. Each new son represented David's increasing power and political connections. Meanwhile, Saul's kingdom was falling apart from within. The breaking point came when Ishbosheth made a serious accusation against Abner. In verse 7, Ishbosheth asked Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" This wasn't just a personal question. Claiming a dead king's concubine was like claiming his throne. Abner exploded with rage. He couldn't believe that after all his loyal service, Ishbosheth would accuse him of treason. In verse 8, Abner shouted back, "Am I a dog's head? On Judah's side, this very day I am loyal to the house of Saul your father, to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David. Yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman." The angry general then made a promise that would change everything. In verse 9, Abner swore, "May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath." He was switching sides, and he meant business. Abner immediately sent messengers to David with a simple question: "Whose land is it?" The meaning was clear. He was ready to hand over all of Israel to David. But David had one condition before he would negotiate. In verse 13, David said, "I will not see your face unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Michal had been David's first wife, but Saul had given her to another man during their conflict. Abner forced Ishbosheth to take Michal away from her current husband, Paltiel. The scene was heartbreaking. Verse 16 describes how Paltiel went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim, but politics required this sacrifice. With Michal delivered, Abner began working to unite the kingdom under David. He met with the elders of Israel and reminded them in verse 17, "For some time you have wanted to make David your king." He also spoke privately with Benjamin's leaders, since they were Saul's own tribe. Everyone agreed to support David. When Abner arrived in Hebron to finalize the peace deal, David treated him with royal honor. They shared a feast, and Abner promised to rally all Israel behind David's throne. In verse 21, Abner told David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may rule over all that your heart desires." David sent him away in peace, believing the civil war was finally over. But Joab was returning from a successful raid, and his men brought news that made his blood boil. They told him that Abner had been in the city, had eaten at the king's table, and had left in peace. Joab couldn't believe what he was hearing. He stormed into David's presence, and in verse 24 demanded, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone." Joab was convinced that Abner was still their enemy. In verse 25 he insisted, "You know Abner, son of Ner. He came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you are doing." Without telling David, Joab sent messengers to bring Abner back to Hebron. They caught up with the general at the well of Sirah and told him David needed to see him urgently. Abner, trusting in the peace treaty, returned immediately. When Abner reached Hebron's gate, Joab met him with a friendly greeting and asked to speak privately. They stepped aside into the gateway, away from watching eyes. Then in verse 27, Joab stabbed him in the stomach and he died. The murder was swift and brutal, revenge for Asahel's death and fear that Abner would replace Joab as David's military commander. David's reaction to the news was swift and decisive. He publicly declared his innocence, saying in verse 28, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord, concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner." He put a curse on Joab's family, praying that they would always suffer disease, disability, and violent death. David commanded everyone in the city to mourn for Abner. He tore his own clothes, put on sackcloth, and walked in the funeral procession. At the burial, David sang another lament, asking in verse 33, "Should Abner have died as the lawless die?" The king's genuine grief convinced everyone that he had nothing to do with the murder. The murder of Abner destroyed what little strength remained in Saul's kingdom. Chapter 4, verse 1 tells us that when Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Without his strong general, the weak king was helpless. Two men saw an opportunity in this chaos. Rechab and Baanah were brothers who commanded raiding parties for Ishbosheth. They were from Beeroth, a town that belonged to Benjamin, which made them technically loyal to Saul's family. But loyalty meant nothing when they saw a chance for personal gain. The brothers made their move during the heat of the day when everyone was resting. In verse 5, they went to the house of Ishbosheth while he was taking his afternoon rest. They pretended they had come to get wheat from the house, which gave them an excuse to go inside. Once they found Ishbosheth sleeping in his bedroom, they struck quickly. Verse 6 simply states, "They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach." After killing the sleeping king, they cut off his head and carried it with them as they escaped during the night. The brothers traveled all night to reach Hebron, convinced they were bringing David exactly what he wanted. In verse 8, they presented the head to David and announced, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." But David's response shocked them completely. Just as he had executed the Amalekite who claimed to kill Saul, David was furious with these murderers. In verse 9, he told them, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me, 'Saul is dead,' and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag." David continued his condemnation in verse 11. "How much more, when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" Without delay, David ordered his men to execute both brothers. They cut off their hands and feet and hung their bodies by the pool in Hebron as a warning to anyone who thought murder would earn David's favor. But David treated Ishbosheth's head with honor. Verse 12 tells us that they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. Even in death, David showed respect for Saul's family. With both Abner and Ishbosheth dead, the northern tribes had no choice but to accept reality. All the leaders of Israel came to David in Hebron to make him their king. Their reasons were practical and personal, as they explained in chapter 5, verse 1. "We are your own flesh and blood." They reminded David of his history with them, saying, in verse 2, "In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" They knew David had been their real leader even when Saul wore the crown. The ceremony was formal and binding. Verse 3 records that all the elders of Israel came to King David at Hebron, and the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. This was David's second anointing, first by his own tribe, now by the entire nation. David was 30 years old when he became king over all Israel, and he would rule for 40 years total, 7.5 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. But first, he needed a capital city that belonged to neither north nor south. Jerusalem was perfect for David's needs. The Jebusites had held this mountain fortress for centuries, and it sat right on the border between Judah and Benjamin. If David could take it, he would have a neutral capital that wouldn't favor any tribe. The Jebusites were confident in their defenses. When David's army approached, they mocked him from the walls. In verse 6, they called out, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They were so sure of their strength that they claimed disabled people could defend the city against David's mighty warriors. But David was determined to take Jerusalem. He offered a special reward, saying in verse 8, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies." The exact details of the attack aren't clear, but somehow David's men found a way into the supposedly impregnable city. Once Jerusalem fell, David made it his home. Verse 9 tells us that David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. He immediately began building projects to strengthen and beautify his new capital. King Hiram of Tyre sent cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons to build David a palace, recognizing David's new power. David's success was obvious to everyone. Verse 12 explains the reason. David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Now that David had a proper capital, he wanted to bring the most sacred object in Israel to Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant. This wooden box contained the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments and represented God's presence among his people. For years, it had been stored in a private home in Kiriath Jearim, almost forgotten during the chaos of Saul's reign. David gathered 30,000 chosen men of Israel for this special mission. This wasn't just moving furniture. This was bringing God himself to live in the capital city. The celebration began immediately as they loaded the ark onto a new cart pulled by oxen. But David made a crucial mistake. He followed the Philistines' example from years earlier instead of God's specific instructions. The law required that only Levites carry the ark using special poles, never touching it directly. Instead, David put it on a cart driven by Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab. The procession was magnificent. Verse 5 describes how David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. The music and dancing showed everyone's joy at bringing God's presence home. But when they reached the threshing floor of Nacon, disaster struck. The oxen stumbled, and the ark started to fall off the cart. Uzzah instinctively reached out to steady it, and the moment his hand touched the sacred box, he dropped dead. Verse 7 explains that the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. David's celebration turned to shock and fear. He became angry at what had happened and afraid to continue. In verse 9, David asked, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" Instead of taking it to Jerusalem, he left the ark at the nearby home of Obed-Edom the Gittite. For 3 months, the ark remained in Obed-Edom's house, and God blessed everything the man owned. When David heard about these blessings, he realized it was safe to bring the ark to Jerusalem if he did it correctly this time. David organized a second procession, but now he followed God's rules exactly. Every 6 steps, they stopped to offer sacrifices. David wore a linen ephod like a priest and danced with all his strength before the ark. The celebration was even greater than before, with shouting and trumpet blasts echoing through the hills. But when David returned home, he faced criticism from an unexpected source. Michal, his wife and Saul's daughter, watched from her window as the procession entered Jerusalem. She was disgusted by what she saw. In verse 16, we read that she despised him in her heart for dancing so wildly. When David came home, Michal confronted him sarcastically. In verse 20, she said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." She thought David had acted beneath his royal dignity. David's response showed his heart for God. In verse 21, he told her, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord." He didn't care what anyone thought about his worship. The chapter ends with a sad note about Michal. Verse 23 simply states that Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. The ark was finally home in Jerusalem, placed inside a tent David had prepared. The kingdom was united, the capital established, and God's presence dwelling among his people. David had risen from fugitive to king of all Israel. After David settled into his beautiful cedar palace, something began to bother him. Every day he lived in luxury, while the ark of God remained in a simple tent. It didn't seem right that the king should have a better house than the Lord himself. David shared his concern with Nathan the prophet, saying in chapter 7, verse 2, "Here, I am living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." Nathan's first response seemed encouraging. In verse 3, the prophet told David, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." But that same night, God gave Nathan a very different message. The Lord had something surprising to say about David's plan to build a temple. God began by reminding David of his history in verse 8. "I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel." God had been with David through every battle and had cut off all his enemies. Then came the shocking reversal. Instead of David building a house for God, God was going to build a house for David. But this wouldn't be a house made of wood and stone. In verse 11, God promised, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you." This house would be a dynasty that would last forever. God explained the plan further in verse 12. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. This son would be the one to build the temple, not David. In verse 13, God said, "He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." The promise went beyond just one son. God was making a covenant with David's entire family line. In verse 16, the Lord declared, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." This wasn't just about Solomon or even about Israel's earthly kings. God was promising something that would reach far into the future. David's response to God's incredible promise showed his true character. He didn't celebrate or boast about his family becoming an eternal dynasty. Instead, he went and sat before the ark of the Lord, overwhelmed by God's grace. His prayer began with wonder and humility. In verse 18, David asked, "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far?" He couldn't understand why God had chosen him from all the people in Israel. David remembered his humble beginnings as a shepherd boy and marveled at how far God had brought him. But David realized that God's promise went far beyond his own lifetime. In verse 19 he said, "And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this is a charter for all mankind, sovereign Lord." David understood that this promise would affect not just Israel, but all nations. David accepted that he wouldn't be the one to build the temple. He focused instead on praising God for his faithfulness. In verse 20, David said, "What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord." He didn't need to explain his heart to God because God already knew everything about him. The king praised God's uniqueness among all the gods of the nations. In verse 22, David declared, "How great you are, sovereign Lord! There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears." He remembered how God had rescued Israel from Egypt and made them his chosen people. David's prayer ended with confidence in God's promises. In verse 25 he said, "And now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised." David believed completely that God would keep his word. He finished by asking for God's blessing in verse 29. "Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing the house of your servant will be blessed forever." With God's promise of an eternal kingdom fresh in his mind, David began a series of military campaigns that would establish Israel as the dominant power in the region. His first target was Israel's oldest enemy, the Philistines. Chapter 8, verse 1 records that David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg-Ammah from the control of the Philistines. This victory was especially significant because the Philistines had terrorized Israel for generations. Now they were paying tribute to David instead of threatening his people. Next, David turned his attention to Moab. The nation descended from Lot that lived east of the Dead Sea. The campaign was brutal and decisive. Verse 2 tells us that David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. The surviving Moabites became David's subjects and brought him tribute. David's biggest victory came against Hadadezer, king of Zobah, who controlled territory in modern-day Syria. When Hadadezer tried to restore his control along the Euphrates River, David struck him down. Verse 4 records the massive scale of David's victory. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, David defeated them too. Verse 6 says that David put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. David was building an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates River. The wealth from these conquests was enormous. David took gold shields from Hadadezer's officers and large amounts of bronze from his cities. King Tu of Hamath, hearing of David's victory, sent his son with gifts of gold, silver, and bronze articles to congratulate the conqueror and make peace. David dedicated all this wealth to the Lord. Verse 11 explains that King David dedicated these articles to the Lord as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued. The temple that Solomon would build would be funded by David's military victories. The empire now included defeated Edomites in the south. Verse 14 records that David put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. Everywhere David went, the Lord gave him victory. To govern this vast empire, David organized an efficient administration. Joab remained commander of the army, while Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, became recorder. Zadok and Ahimelech served as priests, Sariah was secretary, and Benaiah commanded David's personal guard. Verse 18 adds that David's sons were priests, showing how the king kept important positions within his family. In the midst of his military triumphs, David remembered a promise he had made years earlier. He had sworn an oath of friendship to Jonathan, Saul's son, and now he wondered if any of Jonathan's family had survived the wars and purges. David asked his servants in verse 1, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" His officials found a former servant of Saul's household named Ziba, who had valuable information about surviving family members. When Ziba came before the king, David asked him the same question. Ziba revealed that Jonathan had a son who was still alive. In verse 3, Ziba explained, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." This was Mephibosheth, who had been crippled in a childhood accident when his nurse dropped him while fleeing from the news of Saul and Jonathan's deaths. David immediately ordered Mephibosheth to be brought from Lo-debar, where he had been living in hiding. When the young man arrived, he fell face down before David in terror. He expected to be executed as a potential threat to David's throne, which was the normal practice when dynasties changed. But David's words shocked him completely. In verse 7, David said, "Don't be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." This wasn't just mercy, it was honor and wealth beyond Mephibosheth's wildest dreams. Mephibosheth couldn't believe what he was hearing. In verse 8, he responded, "What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me?" He saw himself as worthless and powerless, completely at David's mercy. But David was serious about his promise. He called Ziba back and gave him detailed instructions. In verse 9, David told him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. Ziba and his 15 sons and 20 servants would work the land, but all the produce would belong to Mephibosheth." The chapter ends with a beautiful picture of covenant loyalty. Verse 11 tells us that Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Despite being lame in both feet, Mephibosheth was treated as family. David kept his promise to his dead friend Jonathan by caring for Jonathan's son as if he were his own child. David's desire to show kindness extended beyond Israel to neighboring nations. When Nahash, king of the Ammonites, died, David decided to send a delegation to express sympathy to the new king, Hanun. Chapter 10, verse 2 explains David's reasoning. I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. David chose several of his officials to serve as ambassadors and sent them to the Ammonite capital with a message of condolence. This was standard diplomatic practice. Kings often sent representatives to funeral ceremonies of neighboring rulers to maintain peaceful relationships. But Hanun's advisors were suspicious of David's motives. They convinced the young king that this wasn't a genuine gesture of sympathy, but a clever spy mission. In verse 3, Hanun's officials warned him, "Do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to you to express sympathy? Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and overthrow it?" Hanun listened to his advisors instead of accepting David's gesture at face value. What he did next was an act of extreme insult that guaranteed war. Verse 4 records the humiliation. So Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away. This wasn't just rude behavior. It was a calculated insult designed to shame David and his representatives. In that culture, a man's beard was a symbol of his dignity and maturity. Cutting someone's beard was like saying he was worth nothing. Exposing their buttocks added sexual humiliation to the insult. When David heard what had happened to his ambassadors, he was furious at the insult but compassionate toward his men. He knew they would be too ashamed to return to Jerusalem in their condition. In verse 5, David sent word to them, "Stay at Jericho till your beards have grown, and then come back." He wanted to spare them further embarrassment. The Ammonites realized they had made David their enemy and began preparing for war. They hired Syrian mercenaries to strengthen their army. 1,000 talents of silver bought them 32,000 chariots and charioteers from various Syrian kingdoms. They also allied with the king of Maacah and 12,000 men from Tob. When David learned about these military preparations, he knew the situation was serious. The Ammonites had turned a simple diplomatic gesture into a major international conflict, and now they were gathering the largest army Israel had ever faced. Joab arrived with Israel's army to find himself facing a military nightmare. The Ammonites had positioned themselves in front of their city gate, while their Syrian allies spread out in the open field. This meant Israel would have to fight on two fronts simultaneously, exactly what the enemy wanted. But Joab was an experienced general who didn't panic under pressure. He made a brilliant tactical decision by dividing his forces. In verse 11, Joab told his brother Abishai, "If the Arameans are too strong for me, then you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come to rescue you." This plan allowed each brother to focus on one enemy while knowing help was available if needed. Before the battle began, Joab gave his men a speech that revealed his heart for God and country. In verse 12 he declared, "Be strong, and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight." Joab understood that they were fighting not just for military victory, but for God's people and God's honor. The battle strategy worked perfectly. When Joab attacked the Syrians, they broke and ran. Seeing their allies fleeing, the Ammonites also retreated before Abishai and shut themselves inside their city. Verse 14 simply states, "When the Ammonites realized that the Arameans were fleeing, they fled before Abishai and went inside the city." But the war wasn't over. Hadadezer, the Syrian king David had defeated before, decided to gather all his forces for one final attempt to defeat Israel. He brought Syrian troops from beyond the Euphrates River under the command of Shobach, his army commander. This time, David didn't send Joab to fight the battle. He took personal command of Israel's forces and marched out to meet the Syrians at Elam. The battle was decisive and devastating for Israel's enemies. Verse 18 records the massive scale of David's victory. But they fled before Israel, and David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. He also struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. The Syrian coalition was completely destroyed. The defeat was so complete that it ended Syrian resistance to Israel permanently. Verse 19 explains the result. When all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been routed by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. David's empire now reached all the way to the Euphrates River, just as God had promised Abraham centuries earlier. In the spring, when kings normally led their armies to war, David made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of going with his troops to finish the siege of Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, he stayed in Jerusalem. Chapter 11, verse 1 sets the scene. David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David was walking on the roof of his palace when he saw something that captured his attention. A woman was bathing, and she was very beautiful. Instead of looking away, David stared and then sent someone to find out who she was. His servant brought back troubling information. In verse 3, the messenger reported, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." David now knew 3 important facts: her name, her father's identity, and most importantly, that she was married. Her husband Uriah was one of David's own soldiers, currently fighting in the siege David should have been leading. Despite knowing she was married, David sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to the palace. Verse 4 records what happened next. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. The text notes that she had purified herself from her monthly uncleanness, which would soon become significant. After their encounter, Bathsheba returned home, but a few weeks later she sent David a message that filled him with dread. In verse 5, she told him simply, "I am pregnant." With just 3 words, David's secret sin became a crisis that could destroy his reputation, his family, and his kingdom. David's first instinct was to cover up what had happened. He sent word to Joab at the battlefront, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." David's plan was simple. If he could get Uriah to sleep with his wife, everyone would assume the baby was Uriah's. When Uriah arrived in Jerusalem, David pretended to want a military briefing. He asked about Joab, the soldiers, and how the war was going. Then he dismissed Uriah with instructions to go home to his wife. David even sent a gift to Uriah's house, probably hoping to create a romantic mood. But David's plan failed because of Uriah's integrity. Instead of going home to Bathsheba, Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with David's servants. When David learned about this, he called Uriah back and asked in verse 10, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah's answer revealed his noble character. In verse 11, he explained, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." While his king was enjoying palace luxury, Uriah refused to indulge in pleasures his fellow soldiers couldn't share. Desperate to make his plan work, David kept Uriah in Jerusalem another day and got him drunk, thinking alcohol might weaken his resolve. But even drunk, Uriah maintained his principles. Verse 13 says that he went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. With his cover-up attempt failing, David chose a path that would haunt him forever. He wrote a letter to Joab and gave it to Uriah to carry back to the battlefield. The bitter irony was that Uriah was carrying his own death sentence. The letter contained David's coldest command. In verse 15, David ordered Joab, "Put Uriah out in front, where the fighting is fiercest." Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." David was using his position as king to commit murder, and he was making his loyal general an accomplice. Joab obeyed his king's order. He positioned Uriah at the most dangerous spot during an attack on Rabbah's walls. When the enemy fought back, fiercely Joab pulled his men back and left Uriah exposed. Uriah died in battle, along with several other soldiers, just as David had planned. When the battle report reached David, Joab included a message designed to prevent the king from getting angry about the military losses. But David's response showed his true priorities. After hearing that Uriah was dead, verse 25 records David's callous reply, "Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another." When Bathsheba heard about her husband's death, she mourned for him according to custom. But as soon as her mourning period ended, David sent for her. Verse 27 concludes the chapter with David's apparent success. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the chapter ends with an ominous warning that David's sin hadn't gone unnoticed. The final sentence declares, "But the thing David had done displeased the Lord." David thought his secret was safe, but God sees everything. The Lord sent Nathan the prophet to confront the king, but Nathan was wise enough to approach the subject carefully. Instead of directly accusing David, he told a story that would make the king condemn himself. In chapter 12, verse 1, Nathan began his parable. There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had large flocks of sheep and cattle, while the poor man had only one little lamb that was like a daughter to him. The lamb ate from the poor man's table, drank from his cup, and slept in his arms. Nathan continued his story in verse 4. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David's reaction was immediate and furious. He exploded with righteous anger at the injustice described in Nathan's story. In verse 5, David declared, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die." He continued his condemnation in verse 6. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Nathan had set the perfect trap. With David's own words condemning the rich man's actions, the prophet delivered the devastating revelation. In verse 7, Nathan declared, "You are the man." Then he delivered God's message directly to the king's face. God reminded David of all his blessings through Nathan's words in verse 8. "I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more." David had everything he could want, yet he still took what belonged to another man. Nathan then detailed David's sins in verse 9. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your wife. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." God saw both the adultery and the murder, and he held David responsible for both. The judgment was swift and severe. Nathan announced God's punishment in verse 11. "Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight." David's secret sin would be repaid with public humiliation, but the immediate consequence would be even more heartbreaking. In verse 14, Nathan told David, "Because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord. The son born to you will die." The innocent child would pay the price for his father's guilt. David's response showed genuine repentance. In verse 13, he simply said, "I have sinned against the Lord." There were no excuses, no attempts to justify his actions, just honest confession of guilt. Nathan confirmed that David's repentance was accepted. He told the king, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die." David would live, but he would face the consequences of his choices. The judgment began immediately. The baby became seriously ill, and David did everything he could to save his son's life. He fasted, lay on the ground all night, and refused to eat. His officials were afraid to tell him when the child died on the seventh day, thinking David might harm himself. But David's reaction surprised everyone. When he realized the child was dead, he got up, washed, changed his clothes, and went to worship in the house of the Lord. Then he went home and asked for food. His servants were confused by his behavior. When they asked why he was acting normally, after the child's death, David explained in verse 23, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, 'Who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live.' But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." David then comforted Bathsheba in her grief, and she became pregnant again. When their second son was born, they named him Solomon. Verse 24 adds that the Lord loved him, showing that God's judgment was complete and his mercy was returning. Meanwhile, the siege of Rabbah was nearing its end. Joab sent word to David that the city was about to fall and urged the king to come personally to capture it. David gathered his forces and went to Rabbah, taking the city and claiming the victory. He took the royal crown, which weighed a talent, of gold, and made it his own. The conquest was complete, but David's personal battles were just beginning. The consequences of his sin with Bathsheba would echo through his family for years to come. Nathan's prophecy about trouble coming from David's house began with his oldest son, Amnon. Chapter 13, verse 1 tells us that Amnon fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. But this wasn't love. It was destructive lust that consumed Amnon completely. Verse 2 describes how Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. His cousin Jonadab noticed Amnon's condition and devised a wicked plan. In verse 5 he told Amnon, "Go to bed and pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat.'" Amnon followed this evil advice perfectly. When David came to check on his sick son, Amnon made his request exactly as suggested. David, caring for his son's health, immediately sent word to Tamar to help her brother. She came innocently to Amnon's house and prepared bread while he watched from his bed. But when Tamar brought the food, Amnon told everyone else to leave. Once alone, his true intentions became clear. In verse 11, he grabbed Tamar and said, "Come to bed with me, my sister." Tamar was horrified and tried desperately to stop him. In verse 12, she pleaded, "No, my brother, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing." But Amnon was beyond reason. Verse 14 records the brutal reality. But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. What happened next revealed how twisted Amnon's feelings really were. Verse 15 describes the shocking change. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. He threw her out of his house, leaving. Tamar devastated. When Absalom found his sister crying, he told her to be quiet, but his calm words hid burning rage that would eventually explode. For 2 long years, Absalom said nothing about what Amnon had done to their sister. Chapter 13, verse 22 explains his strategy. Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. But Absalom's silence didn't mean he had forgotten. He was planning something terrible. The opportunity for revenge came during sheep shearing season, a time of celebration and feasting. Absalom owned property in Baal Hazor and decided to throw a party there. He went to David with what seemed like an innocent invitation. In verse 23, Absalom said, "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his attendants please join me?" David declined, knowing his entire court would be expensive to entertain. When Absalom pressed him, David blessed his son, but still refused to come. Then Absalom made what seemed like a reasonable alternative request. In verse 26 he asked, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." David found this request puzzling, but eventually agreed to send all the king's sons to the celebration. The sheep shearing festival proceeded normally at first, with plenty of food, wine, and celebration, but Absalom had given his servants secret instructions. In verse 28 he told them, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid, haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave." When the moment was right and Amnon was drunk and relaxed, Absalom gave the signal. His servants struck Amnon down and killed him instantly. The other princes, seeing their brother murdered before their eyes, panicked and fled on their mules. A garbled report reached David before his sons could return home, claiming that all the king's sons were dead. David's grief was overwhelming, until Jonadab explained that only Amnon was dead, killed in revenge for raping Tamar. Soon David's surviving sons returned home, confirming the truth. But Absalom had fled immediately to Geshur, his grandfather's kingdom, where he stayed for 3 years while David mourned for both his dead son and his exiled one. After 3 years of separation, Joab noticed that David's anger toward Absalom was softening. Chapter 14, verse 1 tells us that Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. David missed his son, but his royal position made it difficult to simply recall a murderer from exile. Joab decided to help by arranging a clever intervention using a wise woman from Tekoa. He gave her detailed instructions and had her dress in mourning clothes to make her story believable. When the woman appeared before David, she told him a heartbreaking story about being a widow whose 2 sons had fought, resulting in one killing the other. Now her family wanted to execute the remaining son for murder. She told David in verse 7, "Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed.'" She explained that if her last son died, her family line would be extinct and she would have no one to care for her. David was moved by her plight and promised to protect her son. But then the woman sprang her trap. In verse 13 she said, "Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son." She was pointing out David's inconsistency in protecting her fictional son while keeping his real son in exile. The woman's argument was brilliant and piercing, reminding David that God himself believes in restoration and second chances. When David realized Joab was behind this intervention, he gave in. In verse 21, he told Joab, "Very well, I will do it. Go, bring back the young man Absalom." But David's reconciliation came with a significant condition. Absalom could return to Jerusalem, but was forbidden from seeing his father's face. When Absalom returned to Jerusalem, everyone noticed him, immediately because of his spectacular beauty. Chapter 14, verse 25, explains why, in all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. His most striking feature was his magnificent hair, which was so thick and beautiful that it weighed 5 pounds when cut annually. Despite his beauty and success, Absalom was deeply frustrated by his father's coldness. For 2 full years, he lived in Jerusalem without being allowed to see David's face. This partial reconciliation was worse than exile. He was close enough to the palace to feel rejected every day. Finally, Absalom decided to force a meeting with his father through Joab, who had arranged his return. When Joab ignored his requests twice, Absalom took drastic action. In verse 30, he told his servants, "Look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." This wasn't just property damage. It was a direct challenge that Joab couldn't ignore. The plan worked perfectly. When Joab's barley field went up in flames, he came storming to Absalom's house demanding answers. Absalom was ready with his response. In verse 32 he explained, "Look, I sent word to you and said, 'Come here so I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me if I was still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death.'" Absalom's logic was simple but powerful. He deserved either full restoration or execution, not this painful limbo. Joab recognized the wisdom in this argument and agreed to help arrange the meeting. The reunion was formal but emotional. Verse 33 describes what happened. So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom. After 5 years of separation, father and son were finally reunited, but this reconciliation was only surface deep. Once Absalom regained access to his father, he began preparing for something much bigger than family reconciliation. Chapter 15, verse 1 tells us that Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. This wasn't just royal display. It was political theater designed to make Absalom look like the future king. Every morning, Absalom positioned himself strategically at the gate of Jerusalem, where people came to seek justice from the king. When anyone approached with a legal dispute, Absalom would intercept them before they could reach David's court. His approach was friendly and sympathetic, designed to make people feel heard and valued. Absalom's technique was brilliant political manipulation. In verse 3, when someone came with a case, Absalom would say, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." He was implying that David's government was failing to provide proper justice, while positioning himself as someone who understood their problems. Then Absalom would deliver his killer line. In verse 4 he would say, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." He was promising to be the king Israel needed, accessible, fair, and personally involved in his people's problems. Absalom's false humility was particularly effective. When people bowed to him in respect, verse 5 tells us that he would reach out his hand and take hold of them and kiss them. Instead of accepting formal honor, Absalom treated everyone like a close friend. The strategy worked perfectly over 4 years. Verse 6 explains the result. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. After 4 years of preparation, Absalom was ready to launch his rebellion. He went to David, asking permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a religious vow, and David gave his blessing, not suspecting treachery. But Absalom had already sent secret messengers throughout Israel with instructions to proclaim him king. When they heard the trumpet signal, the news hit David like a thunderbolt. A messenger came running to the palace with devastating information. In verse 13 he reported, "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom." David's own son had successfully stolen the loyalty of the entire nation and was marching on Jerusalem with an army. David's response was immediate and practical. He knew Jerusalem's walls could become a trap if besieged. In verse 14, David told his officials, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." The evacuation began immediately. David's household, officials, and loyal soldiers prepared to leave the capital, though he left 10 concubines to care for the palace. As the procession moved out, David was encouraged to see his bodyguard remain loyal, including 600 Gittites under foreign commander Ittai. David tried to release Ittai from obligation since he was a foreigner who had only recently joined David's service, but Ittai's response revealed true loyalty. In verse 21, he declared, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." When David reached the Kidron Valley and saw the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, he made a decision that revealed his faith in God's sovereignty. In verse 25, David told Zadok, "Take the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again." David understood that the Ark belonged in Jerusalem, not in exile with a fleeing king. As David climbed the Mount of Olives weeping, he received devastating news that his most trusted counselor Ahithophel had joined Absalom's rebellion. This betrayal hit David harder than his son's revolt. He immediately prayed in verse 31, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." But God provided help when Hushai the Archite arrived, whom David sent back to Jerusalem as a double agent to frustrate Ahithophel's advice from within Absalom's court. As David's procession continued its journey away from Jerusalem, they faced both hostility and unexpected kindness. When they reached Bahurim, a man named Shimei from Saul's family came out cursing and throwing stones at the king and his supporters. Chapter 16, verse 7, records Shimei's bitter words, "Get out, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son, Absalom." Every word was designed to wound David's spirit during his darkest hour. Abishai, Joab's brother, was furious at this insult to his king. In verse 9, he asked David, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." But David's response revealed his broken but still faithful heart. In verse 10, he told Abishai, "What does this have to do with you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why do you do this?'" David was wondering if God himself had sent Shimei to curse him as part of his punishment. David continued his remarkable response in verse 11. "My son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to." If his own son could betray him, why should David be surprised by a stranger's hatred? Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Absalom was taking control of the city with disturbing symbolism. When Hushai arrived and offered to serve the new king, Absalom questioned his loyalty, but Hushai gave a clever answer that satisfied his ego. Ahithophel then gave shocking counsel about how Absalom should establish his authority. In verse 21, he told Absalom, "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father." This wasn't just political advice, it was the fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy that David's wives would be given to another in broad daylight. A tent was set up on the palace roof, and verse 22 records that Absalom slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. The next morning, Ahithophel presented Absalom with a plan that could have ended the rebellion immediately. In chapter 17, verse 1, he proposed, "I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David." Ahithophel wanted to strike while David was tired, disorganized, and demoralized. His strategy was brilliant: attack David personally while his forces were scattered and weak. The plan impressed everyone who heard it, but Absalom made a fatal mistake by asking for a second opinion from Hushai. When Hushai was called in, he carefully undermined Ahithophel's counsel. In verse 8 he warned, "You know your father and his men. They are fighters and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs." Instead, Hushai proposed gathering all Israel for a massive campaign with Absalom personally leading, which sounded more glorious but would take much longer. Verse 14 records the crucial decision. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel." But the text adds the real reason, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Ahithophel realized immediately that his counsel had been rejected and that Absalom's cause was doomed. His response was tragic. Verse 23 tells us he put his house in order and then hanged himself. Meanwhile, David crossed the Jordan River and organized his forces at Mahanaim. When both armies were finally ready for battle, the confrontation took place in the forest of Ephraim. David's commanders refused to let him fight personally, but he gave them a crucial instruction that everyone could hear. In chapter 18, verse 5, he ordered, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." The battle was a disaster for Absalom's forces. Verse 7 records that casualties were great. 20,000 men died. David's experienced soldiers proved superior to Absalom's larger but less experienced army. The forest itself became Absalom's enemy, and many soldiers became lost or trapped in the dense woods. Absalom met an ironic end when his magnificent hair, which had been his pride, became his trap. Verse 9 describes what happened. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's hair got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept on going. When Joab heard that Absalom was hanging helpless, he took 3 javelins and thrust them into the rebel prince's heart. With their leader dead, Absalom's army collapsed completely. The handsome prince, who had tried to steal his father's throne, ended up in an unmarked grave. The news of Absalom's death should have been cause for celebration, but David's reaction shocked everyone. Chapter 19, verse 1 tells us that Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." Instead of thanking God for victory, David was consumed with grief for his rebellious son. His loud weeping echoed through the palace as he cried out in verse 4, "O my son Absalom! O Absalom, my son, my son!" The man who had tried to kill him was the only person David could think about. The victory celebration turned into a funeral atmosphere. Verse 2 explains that for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, "The king is grieving for his son." David's soldiers had risked their lives to save him, but now they felt ashamed of their success. These brave warriors, who should have been heroes, sneaked back into the city like defeated men. Verse 3 describes how the men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. Joab couldn't stand watching this any longer. He marched straight into David's private chambers, where the king was still crying. Joab's words in verse 5 were harsh but necessary. "Today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines." Joab continued his rebuke with brutal honesty in verse 6. "You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead." Then Joab delivered his ultimatum. In verse 7, He warned David, "Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now." David realized that Joab was right. His personal grief was destroying the kingdom he had fought so hard to save. Slowly, David composed himself and went to sit in the gateway where his people could see him. Word spread quickly that the king was available, and verse 8 tells us that all the men came before the king. The process of healing could finally begin. David's return journey to Jerusalem became a careful exercise in political forgiveness and wisdom. One of his first encounters was with Shimei, the man who had cursed and thrown stones at him during his escape from Absalom. Now Shimei came running with 1,000 Benjamites to meet David at the Jordan River. Shimei fell down before the king, and in verse 19 pleaded, "May my Lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind." Abishai still wanted to execute Shimei for his earlier insults, but David chose mercy instead. In verse 22, David declared, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am king over Israel?" David swore an oath that Shimei would not die. Next came Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who looked terrible after not caring for his appearance during David's absence. His feet were unwashed, his beard untrimmed, and his clothes dirty. When David asked why he hadn't come along during the exile, Mephibosheth explained in verse 26, "My lord the king, since I your servant am lame, I said I will have my donkey saddled and will ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba my servant betrayed me." The truth about Ziba's lies finally came out, but David was tired of family disputes. In verse 29, he told Mephibosheth, "Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land." Mephibosheth's response showed his true heart. He told David that Ziba could have it all since the king had returned safely. The most touching encounter was with Barzillai, the old man who had provided food and supplies during David's exile. When David invited him to live in Jerusalem, Barzillai politely declined. In verse 35 he said, "How many more years will I live that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers?" Instead, Barzillai sent his son Kimham to serve in the royal court. But as David's procession approached Jerusalem, old tribal tensions began to surface. The men of Judah had arranged David's crossing of the Jordan, but the northern tribes felt left out. In verse 41, the men of Israel complained to David, "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan, together with all his men?" This argument would soon explode into another crisis. The argument between Judah and the northern tribes created the perfect opportunity for another rebel. A troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri, saw his chance and blew a trumpet to get everyone's attention. Chapter 20, verse 1 records his rallying cry, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son, every man to his tent Israel." This slogan appealed to northern resentment against southern dominance. The response was immediate and devastating. Verse 2 tells us that, "So all the men of Israel deserted David to follow Sheba, son of Bichri. But the men of Judah stayed by their king all the way from the Jordan to Jerusalem." The kingdom was splitting apart again, just when David thought peace was restored. David acted quickly to prevent this new rebellion from gaining strength. He gave Amasa, his new army commander, 3 days to mobilize Judah's forces. In verse 4, David ordered, "Summon the men of Judah to come to me within 3 days and be here yourself." But Amasa took longer than the deadline David had given him. David couldn't wait any longer and turned to Abishai for help. In verse 6, David warned, "Now Sheba son of Bichri will do us more harm than Absalom did. Take your master's men and pursue him, or he will find fortified cities and escape from us." Abishai took Joab's men, the royal bodyguard, and all the fighting men to chase after Sheba. As they marched out of Jerusalem, they met Amasa coming to join them at the great rock in Gibeon. What happened next was swift and brutal. Joab greeted Amasa like an old friend, asking how he was doing. As Joab reached out with his right hand to grab Amasa's beard for a friendly kiss, verse 10 records the treachery. Amasa was not on his guard against the dagger in Joab's hand, and Joab plunged it into Amasa's belly, and his intestines spilled out on the ground. Without being stabbed again, Amasa died. Joab had murdered another rival for military leadership. One of Joab's men stood over Amasa's body and shouted to the troops, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." When the soldiers kept staring at the corpse instead of marching, someone dragged Amasa's body off the road and covered it with a cloth. Then all the men continued following Joab in pursuit of Sheba. Sheba's rebellion led him north through all the tribes of Israel, gathering support as he went. He finally took refuge in the city of Abel-Beth-Maachah, which was known for its wisdom and peaceful nature. Joab arrived with his army and began building siege works to break down the city walls. The situation looked hopeless for the people trapped inside with Sheba. But then a wise woman from the city called out from the wall to get Joab's attention. When he came near, she asked in verse 17, "Are you Joab?" When he confirmed his identity, she said, "Listen to what your servant has to say." Joab agreed to hear her out. The woman began by reminding Joab of her city's reputation. In verse 18 she said, "Long ago they used to say, 'Get your answer at Abel,' and that settled it." She was telling him that Abel-Beth-Maachah was famous for wise counsel and peaceful solutions to problems. Then she made her main argument in verse 19, "We are the peaceful and faithful in Israel. You are trying to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why do you want to swallow up the Lord's inheritance?" She was appealing to Joab's better nature, asking why he would destroy innocent people who had done nothing wrong. Joab's response showed that he wasn't interested in senseless destruction. In verse 20, he replied, "Far be it from me to swallow up or destroy." He explained his real purpose in verse 21. That is not the case. A man named Sheba son of Bichri from the hill country of Ephraim has lifted up his hand against the king, against David. Hand over this one man, and I'll withdraw from the city. The woman immediately agreed to this reasonable solution. She told Joab confidently, "His head will be thrown to you from the wall." The wise woman then went to her people and convinced them that sacrificing one rebel was better than watching their entire city be destroyed. The people of Abel-Beth-Maachah executed Sheba and threw his head over the wall to Joab. Verse 22 concludes, "So he sounded the trumpet, and his men dispersed from the city, each returning to his home. And Joab went back to the king in Jerusalem. The rebellion was over, the city was saved, and peace was restored through wisdom rather than warfare." The chapter ends by listing David's government officials, showing that normal administration had resumed with Joab back as army commander despite his continued violence. During David's reign, Israel was struck by a terrible famine that lasted 3 long years. Crops failed, people went hungry, and the land suffered. David finally did what he should have done from the beginning. He sought the Lord's face to understand why this disaster had come upon his kingdom. Chapter 21, verse 1 tells us what God revealed. It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It's because he put the Gibeonites to death. Years earlier, Saul had broken a sacred oath that Joshua had made with the Gibeonites centuries before. The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but Israel had sworn to protect them. Despite this covenant, Saul had tried to wipe them out in his zeal for Israel and Judah. Now God was holding the nation accountable for this broken promise. David immediately called the surviving Gibeonites to meet with him. He asked them directly in verse 3, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make atonement so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites didn't want money or the right to kill Israelites in revenge. Instead, they had a specific request. In verse 6, they told David, "Let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed, and their bodies exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul," the Lord's chosen one. They wanted justice through the execution of 7 men from Saul's family. David agreed to their request, but was careful to protect those under his personal oath. Verse 7 explains, "The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord between David and Jonathan, son of Saul." David had made a sacred promise to Jonathan, and he would not break it even to end the famine. Instead, David chose 7 other descendants of Saul, 2 sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine, and 5 grandsons through Saul's daughter Merab. The Gibeonites executed all 7 men at the beginning of barley harvest and left their bodies exposed on the mountain. This was meant to be a public demonstration that justice had been done for Saul's crimes. But then something beautiful and heartbreaking happened. Rizpah, the mother of 2 of the executed men, took sackcloth and spread it on a rock. From the beginning of harvest until the rains came, she stayed there day and night, protecting the bodies from birds and wild animals. Her faithful vigil lasted for months, and verse 10 tells us that she did not let the birds touch them by day or the wild animals by night. When David heard about Rizpah's devotion, he was moved to show proper honor to the dead. He arranged for the bones of Saul and Jonathan to be brought from their burial place and gave them a proper burial alongside the 7 executed men. Verse 14 records, "They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the tomb of Saul's father Kish at Zelah in Benjamin, and did everything the king commanded." After that, God answered prayer in behalf of the land. As David grew older, his legendary strength began to fade, and this became dangerously apparent during another war with the Philistines. Chapter 21, verse 15 sets the scene. Once again, there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines, and he became exhausted. During this battle, David faced Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, the ancient race of giants. This giant warrior carried a bronze spear that weighed 300 shekels and wore a new sword. Verse 16 tells us that he said he would kill David. The aging king was in serious danger, but his loyal warriors came to his rescue. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, struck down the giant and saved David's life. After this close call, David's men made an important decision. They told their king in verse 17, "Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished." They realized that David was too valuable to risk in personal combat anymore. His days as a warrior were over, but his role as king and spiritual leader continued. The text then honors the mighty warriors who continued fighting the giants in David's place. At Gob, there was another battle with the Philistines where Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Saph, another descendant of Rapha. In yet another battle at Gob, Elhanan son of Jair killed Goliath the Gittite's brother, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's rod. The most impressive giant killer was Jonathan, son of David's brother Shimea. This giant he faced had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total. Verse 21 tells us that when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shimea, David's brother, killed him. The chapter concludes by noting in verse 22 that these four were descendants of Rapha in Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. The race of giants that had terrorized Israel since the days of Moses was finally being eliminated by David's mighty warriors. Even though David could no longer fight them personally, his legacy lived on through the brave men he had trained. And, inspired, near the end of his life, David composed a magnificent psalm that summarized God's faithfulness throughout his entire journey from shepherd boy to king. Chapter 22 preserves this song of deliverance, which begins in verse 2 with David declaring, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation. He is my stronghold, my refuge and my savior. From violent people you save me." David remembered how God had rescued him from every enemy, describing his deliverance in vivid imagery. In verse 5 he sang, "The waves of death swirled about me, the torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. But God heard his cry for help." Verses 8 to 9 paint a dramatic picture of divine intervention. The earth trembled and quaked, the foundations of the heavens shook. They trembled because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils, consuming fire came from his mouth, burning coals blazed. Out of it, David praised God's perfect character, declaring in verse 26, "To the faithful you show yourself faithful, to the blameless you show yourself blameless." He acknowledged that his victories came not from his own strength, but from God's power. In verse 33, David sang, "It is God who arms me with strength and keeps my way secure." The psalm concludes with David recognizing that his success would inspire people from many nations to serve the Lord. After this great song of praise, David spoke his final prophetic words. Chapter 23, verse 1 introduces them. These are the last words of David, the inspired utterance of David, son of Jesse, the utterance of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the God of Jacob, the hero of Israel's songs. These weren't just personal reflections. They were prophecies about the future. David spoke about a coming ruler who would be greater than himself. In verse 3 he declared, "When one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God, he is like the light of morning at sunrise on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth." David understood that his own kingdom was just a shadow of something much greater that was coming. In verse 5, he expressed confidence in God's eternal covenant. "If my house were not right with God, surely he would not have made with me an everlasting covenant, arranged and secured in every part. Surely he would not bring to fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire." David knew that his family line would continue until the perfect king arrived. Before recording David's final sin, the text carefully lists his mighty warriors and their heroic deeds. Chapter 23 catalogues the brave men who had made David's kingdom possible, starting with the three, his most elite fighters. Josheb-Basshebeth killed 800 men with his spear in one battle. Eleazar fought so long that his hand froze to his sword. Shammah single-handedly defended a field of lentils against an entire Philistine army. The list continues with the 30, including foreign warriors like Uriah the Hittite, whose loyalty had cost him his life. After honoring these heroes, the narrative takes a dark turn. Chapter 24, verse 1 tells us that, again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go and take a census of Israel and Judah." This census wasn't for military planning or taxation. It was an act of pride that showed David was trusting in numbers rather than in God. David gave the order to Joab, but his commander immediately objected. In verse 3, Joab protested, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" Even Joab could see that this census was wrong, but David insisted on proceeding. The counting took 9 months and 20 days to complete, revealing that Israel had 800,000 fighting men and Judah had 500,000. But as soon as the census was finished, David realized his mistake. Verse 10 records his repentance. David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing." God sent the prophet Gad to give David 3 choices for punishment: 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from enemies, or 3 days of plague. David chose the plague, saying in verse 14, "Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands." The plague was devastating. In one day, 70,000 people died from Dan to Beersheba. When the destroying angel reached Jerusalem, David saw him standing at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David immediately interceded, "These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family." God commanded David to build an altar at that exact spot. When Araunah offered to give everything for free, David refused, saying, in verse 24, "I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." David bought the threshing floor, an oxen for 50 shekels of silver, built an altar, and offered sacrifices. Verse 25 concludes, "Then the Lord answered prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped." This place, where judgment ended, would become the site of Solomon's temple, connecting David's final sin with future hope. If this deep dive into 2 Samuel opened your eyes to something new about God's Word, I want to ask you for 2 simple favors. First, hit that subscribe button and join our community of Bible explorers. We're just getting started with these, like, You've Never Seen Before series, and there's so much more scripture to discover together. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear these stories. Maybe it's a friend who thinks the Bible is boring, or a family member who's going through their own struggles with power, family, or faith. David's story reminds us that God uses broken people to accomplish his perfect plans. Drop a comment below and let me know which part of David's story hit you the hardest. Was it his dance before the ark, his sin with Bathsheba, Absalom's rebellion, or maybe his final songs of praise? I read every comment and love hearing how God's Word is working in your lives. Thanks for taking this journey through 2 Samuel with me. Until next time, keep digging deeper into the greatest story ever told, because